The morning of July 20th, 2019, started like any other in Oxford, Mississippi. Law enforcement officers were on their routine patrols, keeping an eye on the quiet town. But at exactly 10:23 a.m., a deputy noticed something out of place near an old, weathered wooden picnic table. As he moved closer, his stomach sank. Lying motionless on the ground was the body of a young woman. Any hope that she might still be alive vanished within seconds. She had been shot multiple times. There were no signs of life. The deputy immediately called for backup, and within the hour, the crime scene was flooded with investigators, forensic specialists, and law enforcement officials. They worked quickly to gather evidence, knowing that every second counted in a case like this. The victim was identified almost immediately: 21-year-old Alexandria, a student at the University of Mississippi. Later, the medical examiner confirmed the chilling details. Allie had been shot 9 times at close range. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Let's start from the very beginning and take a closer look at this true crime involving Alexandria Madison Costial, whom her loved ones affectionately called Ally. She was born on September 11, 1997, to Cindy and Keith Costial. From the moment she entered the world, she radiated an infectious warmth and a boundless enthusiasm for life. Growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, alongside her younger brother Andrew, Allie quickly became the heart of her family and social circles. She was the kind of person whose presence alone could brighten even the darkest days. Allie had an undeniable magnetism that drew people toward her. Even as a child, Allie possessed a unique ability to connect with others. She treated strangers with the same kindness and warmth as she did her closest friends and family members. Her generosity of spirit was not just an act of politeness, it was an integral part of who she was. She had a way of making people feel seen, valued, and loved, which was why so many gravitated toward her. Her optimism was unwavering, and her ability to find beauty in even the smallest moments made her truly special. Beyond her glowing personality, Allie was a dedicated and accomplished young woman. Throughout high school, from 2012 to 2016, she excelled both academically and athletically. She was a standout member of the track and field team, the golf team, and the field team. Her leadership skills shone through in her involvement with the Youth Government Support Group and the National Honor Society. But Allie's talents extended beyond the classroom and sports field. She had an insatiable thirst for new experiences and took on numerous extracurricular activities with enthusiasm. She practiced yoga regularly, finding solace in the serenity it brought her, and participated in half marathons whenever she had a break from her studies. Her passion for helping others was equally evident. Allie spent several summers traveling abroad as a volunteer, dedicating her time to teaching young children in Peru and Africa how to speak English. She found immense joy in uplifting those around her, firmly believing in the principle, "Don't be afraid to be who you are." This mantra guided her actions and inspired those who knew her. She embraced people wholeheartedly, never judging them for their quirks or flaws. Her unwavering loyalty made her a treasured friend, and her ability to be unapologetically herself was a quality admired by many. Allie's ambition didn't stop at high school. After graduating, she pursued her lifelong dream of attending the University of Mississippi, better known as Ole Miss, in Oxford. She had envisioned herself there since childhood, and in the fall of 2016, that dream became a reality. There were many reasons why Ole Miss had always been her ideal school. She was drawn to its preppy, classic fashion style, which reflected the refined elegance she adored. The young woman had an affinity for all things pink and was rarely seen without her signature pearl accessories. She had a deep appreciation for beauty, whether in fashion, nature, or life itself. Sunsets were among her greatest passions. She loved the way the sky was painted in hues of pink and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. In fact, she was so enamored with sunsets that she created a social media page solely dedicated to capturing and sharing them with the world. Of course, there were more profound reasons for her love of Ole Miss. She admired the university's deep-rooted traditions, the distinguished professors who inspired her, and the lively atmosphere that made college life exhilarating. She was especially excited about the presence of a major football team, as she had always enjoyed the camaraderie that sports fostered. Enrolling in Ole Miss wasn't just about obtaining a degree in business and marketing. It was about embracing new opportunities, making lifelong memories, and, most importantly, finding happiness. Allie wasted no time immersing herself in campus life. She became a proud member of the Alpha Kappa Psi Women's Club, joined the business community, and even founded a golf club. Her passion for fitness remained strong, and in her free time, she taught yoga and Pilates classes, helping fellow students find balance in their busy lives. Despite her packed schedule, Allie never allowed her studies to suffer. She was meticulous in her time management, ensuring that every aspect of her life was given the attention it deserved. Yet despite all her achievements, there was one thing Allie felt was missing: love. Like many young college students, she dreamed of meeting someone special, someone who would become her partner for life. She had always been enchanted by the charm of Southern boys and the warmth of Southern culture, and she hoped that her time at Ole Miss would lead her to a meaningful relationship. She envisioned a future filled with love, marriage, a happy family, and children of her own. In high school, Allie had experienced infatuations, but none had developed into anything serious. She attended prom without a boyfriend, instead choosing to go with a close girlfriend. Love had eluded her then, but she remained hopeful that college would be different. And finally, her wish came true. Allie met Brandon Theld, a fellow freshman from Fort Worth, Texas. From the moment they met, there was an undeniable spark between them. Allie fell for him instantly, and as their freshman year progressed, they became inseparable. She invited him to almost every party, eager to share every moment of her new life with him. Although many people assumed that Allie and Brandon were in a committed relationship, the truth was far more complicated. Their connection, if it could even be called that, was riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. They never officially declared themselves as boyfriend and girlfriend, never made long-term plans together, and never envisioned a shared future. At times, Brandon would abruptly cut off all communication, blocking Allie's number for weeks or even months. She was drawn to Brandon from the very beginning. She imagined their relationship growing into something profound, a love story that would culminate in marriage and a future together. But Brandon was not the kind of person who valued deep emotional attachments. He was a self-serving manipulator, someone who knew exactly how to string Allie along without ever offering her true commitment. To him, she was just one of many. He had mastered the art of making each woman in his life believe they were special while never investing in any of them beyond temporary gratification. He thrived on the illusion of romance, keeping his options open and his emotions guarded. If Allie ever pressed him for clarity, he deflected, claiming that he was not good enough for her, that she deserved someone better, using false humility as a weapon to keep her tethered to his whims. Their relationship was an emotional whirlwind, an endless cycle of highs and lows. One moment, Allie was euphoric, feeling cherished and adored, and the next, she was consumed by despair, questioning her worth and fighting back tears. Unlike true partners, Brandon never made an effort to integrate himself into her life. He never visited her home, never made an effort to know her friends, and remained a shadowy figure in her world. Most of Allie's close friends barely knew of his existence beyond what she told them, and even then, she revealed very little. She internalized the turmoil, confiding in no one, perhaps even convincing herself that things were not as bad as they seemed. She was isolated, trapped in a one-sided love affair fueled by her own hope and his calculated indifference. In the past, Allie had always been open with her mother, Cindy, sharing the details of her life and her emotions with unfiltered honesty. Cindy knew her daughter had feelings for a boy from her course, but Allie never fully disclosed the true nature of her relationship with Brandon. Perhaps she feared judgment, Or maybe she herself hadn't come to terms with how unhealthy it had become. She wasn't naive. She was simply a 19-year-old woman, far from home, intoxicated by the thrill of attention from someone she cared about. But no matter how much she wished for it, the reality was that she was trapped in a toxic cycle of emotional manipulation. Fast forward to the summer of 2019, a significant time in Allie's life as she approached her final year of college. She had recently turned 21 and had chosen to remain on campus for the summer. She spent those months attending summer courses, engaging in extracurricular activities, and enjoying the company of her friends. Despite the occasional emotional turmoil caused by Brandon, Allie tried to focus on her goals and personal growth. In early July, Allie's parents visited her, a trip that brought her immense joy. They spent quality time together setting up her new off-campus apartment, shopping for essentials, cooking meals, and simply enjoying one another's presence. Allie had missed them dearly and wished they could stay longer. She even begged them to extend their visit by just one more day, but obligations back in St. Louis forced them to leave. Cindy later recalled feeling an unusual heaviness in her heart as they said goodbye, an inexplicable sorrow she couldn't quite place at the time. Still, they kept in touch regularly. Allie frequently called home, updating her parents on her life, her studies, and her daily activities. On July 19, 2019, Allie made one of those routine calls. It was around 7 p.m., and she had just woken up from a long nap. The night before, she had stayed up late studying for an important test, exhausting herself in the process. She chatted with her mother, filling her in on the day's plans. Later that evening, she intended to go out with friends to a bar. It was an ordinary conversation, nothing out of the ordinary, no signs, no warnings, nothing to suggest that in just a few hours, tragedy would strike. Later that night, at exactly 11:52 p.m., surveillance cameras positioned outside a business on Oxford Square captured Allie leaving the bar alone. The footage showed her staring at her phone screen, walking in the opposite direction of the establishment. Later that night, a taxi arrived to pick up Allie. The driver confirmed that she remained polite throughout the short ride back to her apartment. By the time the vehicle pulled up to her residence, it was just past midnight. The driver watched as Allie stepped out, walked toward her building, and disappeared inside. The morning of July 20th, 2019, began as any other, with law enforcement patrolling various areas around Oxford. That day, a Lafayette County deputy sheriff was conducting a routine patrol in Harmon Town near Lake Sardis, a remote area approximately 30 miles north of the Ole Miss campus. The officer didn't expect to find anything unusual, but as he neared an abandoned fishing spot along the shore, his routine drive turned into the start of a harrowing investigation. At precisely 10:23 a.m., the deputy spotted something unusual near a weathered wooden picnic table. As he approached, his worst fears were confirmed. The lifeless body of a young woman lay sprawled across the ground. It was immediately apparent that she had been shot multiple times. No signs of life remained. The officer quickly called for backup, and within the hour, the crime scene was swarming with investigators. The victim was identified almost immediately. It was 21-year-old Ole Miss student Alexandria. The medical examiner later determined that Allie had been shot a total of 9 times at close range. The pattern of shell casings surrounding the scene suggested that the shooter had moved in a circular motion, firing at Allie from multiple angles as she sat on the picnic bench, unable to escape. Investigators located 11 spent shell casings littering the dirt around her, as well as her purse, which had been tossed into a ditch several feet away. Inside the bag, detectives discovered her student ID and driver's license, both of which confirmed her identity. As officers pieced together the crime scene, they noted one peculiar absence. Allie's mobile phone was missing. This small but crucial detail hinted that the killer had taken the device, either to prevent her from calling for help or to erase evidence. Attempts to track the phone's GPS yielded only a vague location ping somewhere in Oxford, providing little useful information. However, Allie's smartwatch, which she often wore, proved to be an unexpected lifeline in the investigation. Allie's smartwatch was synced to her missing phone, allowing investigators to retrieve duplicated text messages from the night of her murder. The records revealed a conversation between Allie and one specific individual, her classmate, 22-year-old Brandon Theld. It wasn't just idle chit-chat. The texts showed that Allie and Brandon had arranged to meet shortly after she left the bar that night, choosing to part ways with her friends for reasons unknown. Allie's friends were quick to confirm Brandon's name when questioned. When asked if anyone might have had a reason to harm Allie, his name surfaced immediately. One of Brandon's own roommates described him as a deeply misogynistic, arrogant individual who frequently made crude, derogatory comments about women. He had a history of manipulating those around him, making false promises, and discarding people once he no longer had use for them. To those who knew him well, it came as little surprise that he might be involved in something sinister. With suspicion mounting, investigators reached out to Brandon, requesting that he come in for questioning. He agreed but failed to appear at the scheduled time. When officers called him again, he provided a flimsy excuse, claiming he had been drinking the night before and wasn't in a state to speak with law enforcement. A second meeting was arranged for the following morning. Again, Brandon agreed, but once more, he failed to show. This time, however, his absence was no accident. Brandon Theld was officially on the run. With Brandon now a fugitive, authorities acted swiftly. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and his name was entered into the national database. Investigators tracked his movements through his mobile phone records and credit card transactions, which painted a clear picture of his escape route. The data indicated that he was heading toward Memphis, Tennessee. A statewide bulletin was sent out, alerting authorities to be on the lookout for his vehicle, a dark-colored pickup truck. Within hours, the Memphis Police Department's fugitive task force spotted a vehicle matching the description at a gas station just outside the city. Officers surrounded the suspect, took him into custody without incident, and discovered damning evidence inside the truck. In the passenger seat of Brandon's vehicle sat a .40 caliber pistol. Forensic analysis later confirmed that this was the same weapon used to kill Allie. Even more incriminating was the presence of bloodstains on Brandon's shirt. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Brandon vehemently denied any involvement in Allie's death. He maintained his innocence, insisting that he had no reason to harm her. But law enforcement wasn't convinced. Within hours of his capture, Brandon Theld was charged with first-degree murder. Following his arrest, Brandon was extradited back to Mississippi, where he was held without bail. He refused to speak with detectives, invoking his right to remain silent until legal counsel was present. Investigators, determined to build a rock-solid case, began piecing together his actions leading up to the murder. They discovered that on the weekend of Allie's death, Brandon had spent time with his usual group of friends. Witnesses confirmed that he had gone bowling with them. However, Sunday took a different turn. That evening, Brandon showed up at a friend's house, carrying a pistol. There was nothing unusual about this either. Brandon arrived at his friend's house carrying a six-pack of beer, a familiar habit for their weekend gatherings. They spent the evening drinking, sharing stories, and engaging in casual target practice, setting up empty cans along the fence line and taking turns shooting at them. Brandon seemed relaxed, unbothered, his demeanor giving no indication of the events that had taken place just hours earlier. But when his friend woke up the next morning, Brandon was already gone. His truck missing from the driveway, his presence vanished without a trace. Brandon Theld was born into a well-respected Christian family in Texas, where he was raised with love and discipline. His parents, both successful doctors, ensured he had a comfortable upbringing. His father owned a private clinic, and his mother worked at a hospital, setting high expectations for their son. Brandon grew up enjoying the great outdoors, hunting and fishing, pastimes that many young men from his town partook in. In high school, he played football, excelling in sports but never showing any signs of aggression or violence. There were no known incidents of fights, outbursts, or behavioral problems. To those who knew him then, Brandon was just another all-American boy with a bright future ahead of him. But something changed when he entered the University of Mississippi. That was where he met Ali Costial at a bar one night. Their attraction was evident, but even from the beginning, it was clear that Ali liked Brandon much more than he liked her. As time went on, Ali's attachment deepened, and she sent him more and more messages. Eventually, the sheer volume of texts overwhelmed Brandon to the point that he blocked her number. But as patterns often repeat, something changed once again, and before long, the two resumed communication. Meanwhile, the investigation into Ali's murder continued, and as details unfolded, the community was shaken to its core. On July 27, 2019, more than 100 people gathered in Oxford for a candlelight vigil in honor of Alexandria Costial. Friends, classmates, and professors mourned the loss of a young woman described as a bright light in their lives, someone who had left an unforgettable mark on everyone she met. One question haunted them all. Who could possibly have wanted to harm Ali? The answer, though devastating, was undeniable. Brandon Theld. On July 23rd, Brandon made his first court appearance, officially charged with the murder of Ali Costial. But as investigators delved deeper into their relationship, they uncovered a shocking revelation that shifted the narrative of the case. The motive, it seemed, was far more heartbreaking than anyone had imagined. In April 2019, just 3 months before her murder, Ali had been preparing for her spring semester final exams. However, unbeknownst to her friends and family, she was also focused on another kind of test, a pregnancy test. On April 12th, Ali sent Brandon a message explaining that feared she might be pregnant. His response was immediate. He instructed her not to tell anyone, not their friends, not her family. He needed time to process what she was saying. 2 days later, Ali sent Brandon a photo of the test. It was unclear, neither fully positive nor definitively negative. A faint second line appeared, leaving room for uncertainty. With the picture, Ali also sent a simple yet significant request. Could they meet in person to talk? Brandon did not respond. Days passed, and Ali sent more messages, growing anxious with each unanswered text. Finally, when Brandon did reply, his response was neither supportive nor kind. His message was brutally clear. He had no interest in discussing it further. If she was pregnant, he wanted her to fix the situation immediately. He urged her to take a pill and put an end to it. He insisted that he did not want a child, claiming that fatherhood would ruin his future. He was unyielding, refusing to offer Ali even the slightest reassurance. If she chose to keep the baby, she would be on her own. He would not help, he would not acknowledge the child, and he would not allow this situation to dictate his life. His words were cold, devoid of emotion, as he repeated over and over that she was making a mistake by keeping the baby. From April through July, Ali continued reaching out, desperately hoping for a conversation, a resolution, some level of understanding. But Brandon avoided her at all costs. He ignored her texts for days at a time, only to reply with short, dismissive responses that made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her or the pregnancy. Several times, Ali asked to meet in person, but Brandon repeatedly canceled at the last minute. Still, she refused to give up. At one particularly dark moment, Ali made a disturbing admission. She had attempted to drink herself into oblivion, hoping that alcohol poisoning would bring an end to her suffering. She listed the staggering amounts she had consumed in a single night: an entire bottle of tequila, 2 bottles of champagne, 7 cans of beer, and a glass of wine. While it was clear to any rational observer that these claims were likely exaggerated, the underlying message was undeniable. This was a desperate cry for help. Many people who knew him regarded him as a spoiled daddy's boy, someone who flaunted his father's wealth as a shield against consequences. He often bragged that his father's money could get him out of any trouble, that no matter what he did, he would never have to face real consequences. But this time, he was wrong. The evidence against Brandon was overwhelming. Beyond the bullet casings that matched his pistol, the bloodstains on his shirt, and the text messages proving he had met Allie that fateful night, there was another damning piece of evidence. One that revealed his state of mind in the aftermath of the crime. When police searched Brandon's apartment, they uncovered a handwritten letter addressed to his parents. While it stopped short of being an outright confession, its contents spoke volumes. In the letter, Brandon expressed guilt and remorse, acknowledging that he was a bad person but insisting that it wasn't his parents' fault. He described being tormented by dark thoughts, which were exacerbated by alcohol, and admitted that he saw no way out. He wrote that he would either go to prison or die, seemingly resigned to his fate. The letter painted a picture of a man who knew he would be caught, a man who had already accepted that his actions would lead to ruin. Brandon's lawyer later claimed that this was nothing more than a suicide note, evidence that Brandon had intended to harm himself. The letter, along with the mountain of other evidence, pointed to one undeniable fact. Allie's murder was premeditated. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered more disturbing details that further solidified their case. 1 week before Allie's death, on Friday, July 12th, Brandon made an unexpected trip from Oxford to Fort Worth, returning to his parents' house under the guise of a casual visit. But the real reason for his trip soon became clear. While at home, he retrieved his pistol, a weapon he had left behind when he moved to college, and brought it back with him to Mississippi. He even took a photograph of the gun and posted it on social media with the caption, "Finally bringing my baby back to Oxford." As detectives continued to piece together the puzzle, they made another chilling discovery. Brandon's internet search history in the days leading up to the murder. Among his searches were phrases like, "how to get away with committing a crime," "how to plan a murder," "how to tie people up," and "how to lure them into a trap." He also looked up tactical face masks and gun silencers. It was clear that Brandon had spent considerable time crafting his plan, ensuring that when the time came, he would be ready. Brandon's defense attorney attempted to argue that internet searches alone did not prove premeditated murder. He claimed that Brandon had simply been curious, that people searched for all sorts of things online without acting on them. He also insisted that Brandon bringing his gun back to Mississippi was not suspicious. After all, Oxford had shooting ranges where students regularly practiced, but the prosecution wasn't buying it. On July 17, 2019, Brandon finally broke his months-long silence and reached out to Allie. For the first time since April, he pretended he wanted to talk about the pregnancy. He dangled the possibility of reconciliation, leading Allie to believe that he was ready to discuss their future. She was ecstatic, unaware that she was walking into a trap. Then on the night of July 18, at precisely 1:53 a.m., Allie sent Brandon a message with a photo of her belly. Though it was barely visible, she was convinced that she was beginning to show. For Brandon, this was the tipping point. The sight of that message ignited a terror in him, one that could only be extinguished by silencing Allie permanently. That very day, Brandon reached out to Allie once again. He casually asked whether her friends would be around when he visited. The young woman, hopeful and naive, believed that Brandon's insistence on secrecy stemmed from the delicate nature of the conversation they were about to have. She interpreted his request as a sign that he was finally taking responsibility and wanted to address the situation in private. Feeling an enormous sense of relief, mixed with nervous anticipation, Allie readily agreed to meet him without witnesses. She reassured herself that he was finally willing to listen and work through the situation together. In reality, however, Brandon had no intention of offering support. His only goal was to ensure that she would be alone, away from prying eyes, and that no one would be able to track her whereabouts once she left with him. By the time July 19 arrived, Brandon was still meticulously setting his plan into motion. He confirmed their meeting time once more, solidifying the arrangement. The two agreed to meet after Allie returned from the bar, with Allie promising to leave early so nothing would interfere with their long overdue discussion. Surveillance footage later captured Brandon's truck, its distinctive license plate clearly visible, heading toward Allie's residence at exactly 1:14 a.m. The same camera later recorded the vehicle moving in the opposite direction, confirming that he had taken her somewhere. GPS data corroborated this, showing that Allie's and Brandon's mobile phones were in close proximity as they traveled through Oxford, their destination, Lake Sardis. Brandon had been drinking heavily throughout the day, drowning himself in alcohol long before picking Allie up. Once they reached the secluded location, he continued consuming alcohol, his intoxication making him more volatile and unpredictable. Seated at an old picnic table by the water, they began talking. Allie, eager and nervous, tried to get him to understand her feelings, to make him see that this was about more than just him. But as the conversation progressed, Brandon's temper flared. Enraged by the situation, frustrated by the reality he refused to accept, he stormed off to his truck. Allie had no idea what was about to happen. Moments later, Brandon returned, now holding a pistol in his hand. Without hesitation, he raised the weapon and opened fire. Allie never stood a chance. She was shot at least 9 times, the force of the bullets knocking her backward, her body collapsing onto the table. One bullet even lodged into the wood, marking the place where she had spent her final moments. Witnesses later recalled hearing multiple shots in the vicinity between 2 and 2:30 a.m. But by the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was too late. At exactly 10 a.m., according to GPS data, both mobile phones began moving back toward Oxford. Brandon, now having committed the crime, didn't waste time dwelling on what he had done. Less than an hour after returning to town, he searched the internet for information on how to monitor police radio channels. Soon after, he scoured the web for news related to Lake Sardis, Mississippi, likely wanting to see if Allie's body had been discovered. Over the next several hours, his phone continued pinging from the same cellular towers as Allie's, until hers abruptly lost signal. Investigators later concluded that Brandon had powered down her phone before disposing of it. Then, as if nothing had happened, he casually went to meet up with his friends, drank beer, and even flaunted his pistol. On August 22nd, Brandon appeared in court for a bail hearing. However, instead of proceeding as planned, his lawyer made a strategic decision. He withdrew the request for bail and instead petitioned the judge to order a psychological evaluation for his client. It was a calculated move, an attempt to delay the case and potentially reduce Brandon's sentence by portraying him as mentally unstable. The judge approved both motions, ensuring that Brandon would remain behind bars without bail while undergoing a psychiatric assessment. A week later, on August 30, 2019, Brandon returned to court, where he was formally charged with the kidnapping and murder of Alexandria Costial. In Mississippi, such crimes carried the possibility of the death penalty. The psychological evaluation found that Brandon was fully sane and competent to stand trial, meaning he would not be able to use mental instability as an excuse for his horrific actions. Despite the overwhelming evidence stacked against him, Brandon pleaded not guilty. His defense team continued to argue that there was no solid proof that he had planned the crime in advance, hoping to poke holes in the prosecution's case. But the digital evidence, GPS data, forensic findings, and his own internet searches told a different story. By the time 2020 arrived, the legal process was still ongoing. The pandemic caused significant delays in the judicial system, pushing back Brandon's trial. By the time the long-awaited trial finally commenced, Brandon Theld made a shocking decision, one that caught many by surprise. After months of insisting on his innocence, after delays, hearings, and legal maneuvering, he suddenly reversed course. On August 27, 2021, Brandon accepted a plea deal, admitting his guilt in the murder of Alexandria Costial in exchange for a reduced sentence. It was a move that spared him the possibility of receiving the death penalty, a strategic choice made by both the defense and the prosecution. State authorities, recognizing the challenges of securing a death sentence given the legal hurdles and evidentiary requirements, agreed to the deal. In doing so, they ensured that the Brandon... As they were making their way home, a few of the searchers decided to take an unplanned detour, What started as a routine search quickly turned into something far more disturbing when they stumbled upon a crucial piece of evidence, one that directly linked the scene to Jodi. The discovery sent a chill down their spines, confirming their worst fears. Later that same day, as the search extended further into the dense woods, investigators came across a sight so horrifying that it shattered any remaining hope of finding Jodi alive. Beneath a careless heap of leaves, branches, and logs, they discovered Jodi's lifeless body, concealed as if in a desperate attempt to hide the grim truth. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. This true crime happened to Jodi Sanderholm, who was born on September 26, 1987, in the quiet town of Arkansas City, Kansas, to her loving parents, Brian and Cindy Sanderholm. She was the third child in the family, growing up with her older brother and sister, Jason and Jennifer. From an early age, Jodi exhibited a passion for dance, an interest that would shape much of her life. However, while dance played a significant role in her daily routine, she was also highly dedicated to her studies, demonstrating an impressive ability to balance both academics and extracurricular activities. Her discipline and intelligence paid off when she graduated as one of 4 valedictorians in her class. During her time at Arkansas City High School, Jodi excelled in multiple areas. She was an active member of the National Honor Society, a Kansas State Scholar, and a Kansas Board of Regents Scholar, distinctions that recognized her academic achievements and dedication. Her exceptional work in science earned her the prestigious Outstanding Physics Student of the Year award, which was presented to her by esteemed educator David Steinamitzi. Alongside her academic pursuits, Jodi was deeply involved in dance. She spent 4 years as a devoted member of the Ark City High School dance team, serving as captain for 2 of those years. Her leadership and talent earned her a place as an instructor at Ark City Dance, and she also worked as an instructor for the Universal Dance Association. Jodi's dedication to dance continued after high school when she enrolled at Cowley College to study pre-pharmacy. Even with her demanding academic schedule, she found time to perform as a member of the Cowley Tigerette dance line, further proving her relentless work ethic and love for the art. In 2007, Arkansas City was a relatively small community with a population of approximately 12,000 residents. Like many parents in the area, Brian and Cindy believed they had chosen a safe and peaceful place to raise their children. On the morning of January 5, 2007, Jodi followed her usual routine, driving her Dodge Stratus to Cowley College for a scheduled dance rehearsal. The practice was set to conclude at 10:45 a.m., and afterward, she planned to return home. However, as the hours passed, something unusual happened. Jodi became unreachable. Cindy, her mother, attempted to call her daughter's cell phone multiple times but received no answer. This was highly uncharacteristic of Jodi, who always made a point to stay in touch with her family. Even if she missed a call, she would typically return it as soon as possible. A gnawing sense of unease took hold of Cindy. She decided to leave work early and go home to check if Jodi had made it back safely. When Cindy arrived at their house, her concern grew into outright fear. Jodi's car was nowhere in sight, even though she was expected to have been home by then. Inside, the absence of her daughter became even more alarming. Jodi had a routine. After returning from dance, she always showered and placed her uniform in the laundry. However, the shower stall was completely dry, and her dance uniform was missing, not in the hamper where she would normally place it. It became clear that she had never returned home after rehearsal. Desperate for answers, Cindy anxiously contacted Jodi's father, Brian, and her older sister, Jennifer. The tension in her voice was unmistakable as she explained that Jodi had not been answering her calls or messages. An immediate sense of unease washed over both Brian and Jennifer, as neither had spoken to Jodi that day, which was highly unusual. By noon, the uneasiness escalated into full-fledged concern. Jodi had missed a critical appointment, one she had spoken about days prior with excitement. Missing it was not like her. Her parents, Cindy and Brian, now deeply alarmed, began reaching out to Jodi's friends, hoping someone might provide a clue. Call after call led them to the same dead end. No one had seen or heard from Jodi since that morning. The last confirmed sighting placed her leaving the college campus after her morning rehearsal. That single detail only deepened the growing fear. Had she been taken? Had something happened between then and the time she was expected to be home? As hours passed with no sign of Jodi, desperation gripped her loved ones. Evening arrived, bringing with it an unbearable sense of dread. Jodi was supposed to be at the Cowley College basketball game that night. Not only was she a dedicated member of the dance team, but she had choreographed the night's routine herself. Skipping the performance was unthinkable. Yet, as the game commenced and the team took their places on the court, Jodi's absence loomed ominously over the event. By 6 p.m., the weight of the situation was undeniable. Cindy and Brian, overwhelmed with fear and uncertainty, made the decision to report their daughter missing. They drove straight to the local police station, their minds racing with every possible scenario. Law enforcement responded swiftly. Officers from the sheriff's department wasted no time distributing flyers bearing Jodi's image and physical description, plastering them across campus, local businesses, and public spaces. Investigators moved quickly, retracing her last known movements and questioning those closest to her. One of the first people authorities reached out to was Colby Wilson, Jodi's longtime boyfriend. They had been together since high school, and he remained a central figure in her life. If anyone knew something, it would be him. When police contacted Colby, he sounded genuinely distraught. He explained that he had been in Texas for several days visiting his brother. Investigators verified his alibi without delay, confirming that Colby had been nowhere near Arkansas City at the time of Jodi's disappearance. He was promptly ruled out as a suspect. However, the following day, January 6th, presented a significant breakthrough in the case. Lori Leglighter, Jodi's best friend and fellow dancer, stepped forward with disturbing information. Lori and Jodi had been inseparable since high school, their friendship cemented by their mutual love of dance. They had both chosen to attend Cowley College, further strengthening their bond. But now, with Jodi missing, Lori recalled an unsettling event from just days prior, something that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now sent a chill down her spine. On the night of January 2, Lori had finished her shift at the Sirloin Stockade restaurant in Arkansas City around 10 p.m. As she stepped into the cold night air, she noticed something peculiar: a light blue car circling the parking lot. Once, twice, 3 times. The repeated passes struck her as odd, but she had brushed it off, assuming it was a driver who had simply lost their way. However, in light of Jodi's disappearance, that same memory now felt menacing. On her way home that night, Lori couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that she was being followed. She glanced into her rearview mirror and noticed the same light blue car following her at a steady distance. At first, she told herself it was a coincidence, but as she made several turns, she realized the car was mirroring her movements precisely. "I thought something strange was going on," Lori later admitted to detectives. "It was too deliberate. It wasn't just someone heading in the same direction. They were following me." To test her growing suspicion, Lori intentionally altered her route, making abrupt turns onto unfamiliar streets. Her pulse quickened when the car remained behind her, unwavering in its pursuit. Panic took hold. Whoever was in that car wasn't just headed the same way. They were hunting her. Thinking fast, Lori made a split-second decision. She veered toward the local police station, praying that the presence of law enforcement would deter her pursuer. As she pulled into the parking lot and parked near the station, she held her breath, eyes locked on her rearview mirror. For a few agonizing moments, nothing happened. Then, relief flooded her as the blue car seemed to disappear into the night. She let out a shaky breath, telling herself she was overreacting. Reassured, Lori started the car again and drove home carefully. But just as she was beginning to relax, her heart nearly stopped. the light blue vehicle had returned. It appeared in her rearview mirror like a ghost from a nightmare. The realization struck like a bolt of lightning. Whoever had been following her hadn't given up. Fear overtook her. Instead of heading straight home, Lori turned sharply, retracing her route back to the police station. She parked, heart pounding, debating whether she should go inside. Ultimately, she dismissed the idea, convincing herself that it might have been a misguided prank by someone she knew. But deep down, she suspected there was more to it than that. On Friday, January 5th, the Tigerette dance line was holding a rehearsal at Cowley College. Lori and Jodi, as usual, arrived at nearly the same time and parked in close proximity to each other. As Lori stepped out of her car, her stomach twisted in unease. There it was again. The same light blue car. This time, she got a clear look at the man behind the wheel. He was a local resident, 23-year-old Justin Thurber. Though she had never personally spoken to him, she recognized him from around town, often seen in the company of his older brother and his friends. The sight of him watching from his car sent an eerie feeling down Lori's spine, but she kept her concerns to herself. That afternoon, Jodi and Lori left practice together, exchanging plans to meet up later. However, as the hours passed, Jodi never showed up for their meeting. As worry set in, Lori began making calls, but Jodi's phone remained unanswered. The unsettling feeling she had experienced earlier now morphed into full-blown dread. In the following hours, several members of the dance team revealed a disturbing detail. Justin Thurber had been spotted loitering near the college parking lot multiple times throughout the past week. He never spoke to anyone, never interacted. He only sat in his car, watching. As the search for Jodi intensified within the first 24 hours of her disappearance, police scoured Arkansas City, but there was no sign of her car. With the city surrounded by fields, wooded areas, and the Arkansas River, they expanded their search efforts. Law enforcement enlisted a fixed-wing aircraft to survey the surrounding terrain from the air, hoping to locate Jodi's missing Dodge Stratus. While a person could be hidden, a car was much more difficult to conceal. The investigation took a critical turn when police traced the last recorded signal from Jodi's cell phone. It had pinged from a tower near the Cow Wildlife Area, a vast stretch of dense forest and open land running along the river. The location was remote, making it an ideal place to hide something, or someone. The area was quickly designated as a focal point of the search effort. At this point, all eyes were on one person, Justin Thurber. With multiple eyewitness accounts placing him near Jodi in the days leading up to her disappearance, he became the prime suspect. But law enforcement's interest in Thurber extended beyond his recent suspicious behavior. He had a long history of trouble with the law. Despite his young age, Thurber was no stranger to the justice system. 3 years earlier, in 2004, he had been arrested and charged with illegal possession of controlled substances. Though he was handed a suspended sentence and granted release, it wasn't long before he found himself back in trouble. 3 months later, he was caught committing theft, violating his probation in the process. His criminal record continued to grow. In October 2005, he faced charges for disorderly conduct, and by January 2006, he had been arrested yet again, this time for petty theft and another drug-related offense. His repeated run-ins with the law painted a troubling picture. And now, in 2007, he had gone from being a petty criminal to a person of serious interest in the disappearance of Jodi Sanderholm. Investigators knew that if they didn't act quickly, they might never find Jodi. Or worse, they might be too late. On December 31, 2006, just 6 days before Jodi Sanderholm vanished, Justin Thurber found himself in trouble with the law once again. That day, he was arrested for theft, an incident that, in hindsight, seemed almost trivial compared to what was to come. However, rather than facing any serious consequences, Thurber was able to post a $3,000 bail and walk free in time to celebrate New Year's Eve without a care in the world. The following day, January 1, he escalated his reckless behavior by impersonating a police officer and disturbing public order. When real law enforcement officers arrived to detain him, he feigned chest pain and was taken to the hospital instead of being booked into jail. Curiously, despite being released from the hospital, no immediate steps were taken to rearrest him. The reason for this apparent leniency remains unclear. Some speculated that a relative of his who worked within the Cowley County Police Department may have played a role in keeping him out of trouble, though this remains unproven speculation. Then came January 6th. A police officer on routine patrol happened to spot Justin Thurber's vehicle, a light blue Cadillac parked outside his parents' home. Seizing the opportunity, the officer decided to speak with him. Thurber's father answered the door and invited the officer inside. When questioned about his whereabouts on January 5th, the day Jodi disappeared, Justin gave an unconvincing and convoluted story. He claimed that he had driven to Winfield, a town about 13 miles outside Arkansas City, early that morning. Once there, he supposedly met up with a friend and two of the friend's acquaintances, people he barely knew. Together, the four of them allegedly drove around the countryside in a car belonging to one of his friend's acquaintances. According to Thurber, their aimless drive took a turn for the worse when the vehicle became stuck on a dirt road near Cedar Vale, a remote location approximately 30 miles from Arkansas City. With no other options, Thurber claimed that he set off on foot toward Arkansas City. After trudging for 6 hours, exhausted and wet, he finally called his father, who picked him up near Cali State Fishing Lake. His father corroborated this story, telling police that he had indeed retrieved Justin a few miles away from the lake, covered in mud and soaked through. However, there were glaring inconsistencies in his tale. When asked what had happened to his own car, which he had supposedly left in Winfield, Justin stated that his friends had returned it for him. This explanation raised more questions than it answered, but at the time, there was still no concrete evidence linking him to Jodi's disappearance, and the officer had no choice but to leave. Later that evening, investigators turned their attention to Alexis Schwartzel, Justin Thurber's ex-girlfriend. She had recently ended a tumultuous 3-year relationship with him, and what she told police only intensified their growing suspicions. Alexis revealed that during their relationship, Justin had frequently taken her to the Kaw Wildlife Area, southeast of Arkansas City. She even identified specific locations that the two had visited, eerie and secluded spots she had always found unsettling. When the detectives informed her that they were investigating Jodi Sanderholm's disappearance, Alexis's face went pale, her hands trembling as she absorbed the gravity of the situation. She then shared a deeply disturbing revelation. Justin had been fixated on Jodi for years. According to Alexis, Thurber had admitted to watching Jodi since he was 13 years old. He would spy on her while she swam in her backyard pool, his presence an unseen shadow lurking in the periphery of her safe space. On some occasions, Alexis revealed, he had stood outside Jodi's bedroom window, waiting for her to change clothes. This chilling confession painted Thurber as an obsessive stalker who had been fixated on Jodi for nearly a decade, his predatory behavior escalating year after year. The more Alexis spoke, the darker the picture of Justin Thurber became. She described how his behavior had grown increasingly erratic and abusive over time. He exhibited different tendencies, often taking pleasure in choking her to the point of unconsciousness during intimacy. He did not just enjoy control, he relished in the fear he induced. In addition, he had disturbing requests. He wanted her to fight him, claiming that violence was the only way he could be aroused. His fascination with domination and pain left detectives with little doubt that Thurber was more than just a troubled young man. He was a dangerous individual with a long history of escalating violence and deviant behavior. Every detail Alexis provided added to the urgency of finding Jodi before it was too late. By late evening on January 6th, investigators had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to take action. Although they lacked definitive proof tying Thurber to Jodi's disappearance, their instincts screamed that he was involved. Detective Eric Mata took the lead, arresting Thurber on charges of bail revocation and suspicion of criminal trespass. The latter charge stemmed from new evidence uncovered during the investigation. Thurber had been on the Cowley College campus, a place where Detective Mata firmly believed he had no legitimate reason to be. When confronted, Thurber immediately requested a lawyer, refusing to answer any further questions. His stone-cold demeanor only heightened the detective's suspicions. Meanwhile, a team of officers arrived at the Thurber family home armed with a search warrant. Their objective was to gather any potential evidence that might link him to Jodi's disappearance. One of the first things they seized was the pair of shoes Justin had been wearing on January 5th. The shoes were still damp and had been left out to dry on a towel. Thurber's father admitted that he had helped his son clean off the mud that coated them, a revelation that raised immediate red flags. Investigators also confiscated the clothes Justin had been wearing when his father picked him up near the lake. However, they soon learned that Thurber had managed to wash them before the police arrived. The attempt to destroy potential evidence only deepened the authorities' resolve to uncover the truth. On January 7th, the search for Jodi Sanderholm intensified as specialized teams trained in tracking human activity in rugged terrain began their meticulous search through the dense and vast Ka wildlife area. The effort yielded its first crucial discoveries: shoe prints that matched Justin Thurber's distinctive tread, along with several smaller shoe prints, potentially belonging to Jodi. Investigators carefully documented the prints, tracing their movements through the thick brush and towards the water's edge. However, as darkness descended, the searchers had no choice but to postpone further investigation until the following morning. On their way home, some of the searchers decided to make an impromptu stop at Cowley County State Fishing Lake, spurred by the knowledge that Justin Thurber had been soaking wet when his father retrieved him. Their instincts proved correct. In the dimming light, they discovered a set of muddy tire tracks leading toward the water's edge, accompanied by numerous muddy shoe prints scattered near a public restroom. Each footprint told a story, a sequence of events waiting to be unraveled. Their search took a chilling turn when they found evidence that tied the scene directly to Jodi. Mail addressed to her parents was discarded inside a chemical toilet, an eerie and deliberate disposal of personal effects. Another cabin contained a pair of dance shoes, delicate and unmistakably belonging to Jodi, a heartbreaking indicator that she had been at this location. A single flip-flop sandal, seemingly out of place, lay nearby. Investigators later uncovered even more damning evidence in the vicinity. Among the recovered items were a pair of cut-off sweatshorts, a wallet containing Jodi Sanderholm's driver's license and social security card, her signature black leotard, a Tigerette dance team jacket embroidered with her first name, a vehicle floor mat, and a car seat cushion. Forensic analysis later confirmed that the impressions on the sandal found at the lake matched the ones discovered at the Ka wildlife area. For the next 2 days, search efforts were concentrated around the lake and the wildlife area, and each passing moment unraveled a grim reality. On January 9, sonar specialists brought in to scan the bottom of the lake made a heartbreaking discovery. Jodi's car lay submerged beneath the water, concealed for more than 3 days. That same day, as the search expanded into deeper parts of the wooded area, investigators came upon a gruesome sight that extinguished any lingering hope for Jodi's safe return. Underneath a haphazard pile of leaves, logs, and twigs, they found Jodi's lifeless, naked body. The evidence connecting Justin Thurber to both the car and Jodi's remains was undeniable. Though investigators initially feared that the water damage to the vehicle's interior would wash away critical evidence, forensic experts spent countless hours meticulously combing through every inch of the submerged vehicle. Their persistence paid off. A single short hair was found inside the car. Terry Melton, director of the Forensic DNA Testing Lab, conducted mitochondrial DNA testing on the strand of hair recovered from the driver's seat. The results confirmed what detectives had already suspected. It was an almost certain match to Justin Thurber. Further DNA evidence sealed his fate. Barbara Leal, an employee at a private forensic lab, conducted testing on biological samples recovered from Jodi's right biceps and chest. The results showed that while 99% of the population could be excluded as a match, Justin Thurber could not. The findings were damning, but the technological proof wasn't the only piece of the puzzle. Cell phone tower records placed Justin and Jodi in the same locations at the same time on the day of her disappearance. Lori Leglighter, Jodi's best friend, told police that she had seen Justin in the Cowley College parking lot on the morning Jodi vanished. When authorities reviewed security footage from the college administration, her account was confirmed. The footage revealed a chilling sequence. Justin Thurber's light blue Cadillac sat parked in the lot while the dance rehearsal was underway. As soon as Jodi left, Justin followed her. Investigators then pieced together what they believed happened next. The presence of Jodi's personal mail at the lake suggested that Thurber had followed her all the way to her home. When she exited her car to retrieve the mail from her family's mailbox, he likely ambushed her. A footprint identical to the tread of Thurber's sneakers was found beside the Sanderholm mailbox, providing irrefutable proof that he had been there. From that moment on, Jodi was at his mercy. Her last movements, though reconstructed through forensic evidence, painted a horrifying picture. As previously discovered, both Justin's and Jodi's footprints were found in the Kaw Wildlife Area. The unsettling pattern of the tracks revealed everything. At first, the two sets of prints walked side by side, but abruptly, Jodi's smaller footprints disappeared. The tracks indicated that at this point, Thurber had lifted her off the ground and carried her deep into the woods. His shoe prints were later found at the exact spot where her body had been discarded. Inconsistencies in Justin Thurber's alibi further cemented his guilt. He had claimed that on the day of Jodi's disappearance, he was with 3 acquaintances, driving through the countryside near Cedar Vale. However, when authorities questioned these individuals, they flatly denied ever being with him. They had not seen him that day at all. This meant that Justin's entire story about getting a car stuck and walking 30 miles was nothing more than an elaborate fabrication. The mounting evidence against Justin Thurber was overwhelming. From forensic DNA analysis to security footage, cell tower records, and contradicting alibis, law enforcement had built an airtight case. What had started as a desperate search for a missing woman had transformed into an undeniable proof of a predator lurking in plain sight. The walls were closing in on Justin Thurber, and the law was ready to bring him to justice. The 3 officers transported Justin Thurber to Cedar Vale, where he claimed to have been when his car got stuck. However, upon arrival, Justin was unable to pinpoint the exact location where he had allegedly encountered trouble, nor could he provide any plausible details that would substantiate his story. His inability to identify the area further deepened law enforcement's suspicions. Back at the police station, Justin, in an attempt to appear cooperative, volunteered to take a polygraph test. He also made a special request for his relative, Chad Monroe, an officer working for the Cowley County Sheriff's Office, to be present during the questioning. Despite his willingness to submit to the test, the accumulating physical and circumstantial evidence was already more than sufficient to indict him. In court, Justin Thurber adamantly denied any involvement in Jodi Sanderholm's murder. However, his continued claims of innocence did little to sway the judicial process. The judge, recognizing the severity of the crime, set his bail at an astonishing $1 million. Justin's defense attorney scrambled to present a case for his mental incompetency, arguing that he was unfit to stand trial. They attempted to paint a picture of a man with severe cognitive limitations. However, these claims were quickly dismantled when evidence was presented showing that Justin had successfully graduated from high school and had even attended college for a period of time. The judge ruled that the defense failed to prove their claim of mental incompetence, allowing the trial to proceed. The medical examiner who conducted Jodi's autopsy provided chilling testimony during the trial. He described in graphic detail the state of her body, recounting how her face and torso were covered in bruises and abrasions, clear indicators of a violent struggle. There were unmistakable ligature marks around her neck, leading to the official determination that the cause of death was strangulation. The examiner went further, stating that there was no doubt in his mind that Jodi's final hours were filled with unimaginable pain and suffering. The brutality of the crime left the courtroom in stunned silence. During the trial, additional victims came forward to testify against Justin Thurber. In addition to his ex-girlfriend, 6 other women took the stand, each recounting unsettling encounters with him. One woman, a former co-worker, revealed that Thurber had stalked her relentlessly. On one occasion, she was so terrified that she called the police and requested an officer to escort her to her car after work. She recounted an instance in which she found a single rose tucked under her windshield wiper, along with a chilling note expressing his infatuation with her and his desire to know her better. The prosecution also presented compelling eyewitness testimonies regarding Jodi's whereabouts on January 5, 2007. Carrie Morris, a close friend of Jodi, recalled a haunting sighting. As their vehicles passed each other in Arkansas City shortly after noon, Carrie noticed Jodi seated in the passenger seat of her own car. The man driving appeared to be large and unfamiliar. Concerned, she immediately dialed Jodi's cell phone, but her call went unanswered. Further eyewitness accounts placed Jodi's car on a secluded dirt road south of Arkansas City around 3 p.m. Two separate women reported seeing a vehicle resembling Jodi's, and one of them positively identified the driver as Justin Thurber. This testimony, coupled with the forensic evidence, painted a devastatingly clear picture of what had transpired. On February 17, 2009, after deliberating, the jury reached a unanimous verdict. Justin Thurber was found guilty on all counts, and the jury recommended the death penalty. As the reality of his fate set in, Justin made a last-ditch effort to save himself. His attorneys approached the prosecution with an offer. Justin would plead guilty in exchange for life imprisonment, thereby avoiding execution. However, Jodi's family vehemently opposed such a deal, unwilling to allow him any semblance of leniency. The presiding judge honored the jury's recommendation, sentencing Justin Thurber to death by lethal injection in March 2009. Despite the firm ruling, Justin Thurber and his legal team embarked on a relentless appeals process. His attorneys repeatedly sought to overturn his sentence, citing his supposed mental incompetency. In 2018, their efforts gained traction when the Kansas Supreme Court postponed his execution. The decision was influenced by a ruling from the United States Supreme Court, which deemed it unconstitutional to execute individuals with even mild developmental disabilities. However, this ruling was met with fierce resistance from Jodi's family. The Sanderholms maintained that a competency hearing had already been conducted during the original trial, and that Justin had been found fully capable of understanding the gravity of his actions. Jodi's mother, Cindy Sanderholm, attended court hearings even years after her daughter's tragic death, determined to ensure that justice prevailed. In a heart-wrenching statement, she revealed that even in prison, Justin continued his disturbing behavior. He had been writing letters to other young women, attempting to initiate contact despite being incarcerated for the brutal murder of Jodi. "That's sick. It's just sick," Cindy said during an interview. "It tells you that he is competent enough to reach out to people and write letters." Now 39 years old, Justin Thurber continues to serve his sentence at the maximum security El Dorado Correctional Facility in Butler County, Kansas. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of all was that Cindy Sanderholm, Jodi's mother, never got to witness the justice she so desperately sought. On December 2, 2022, Cindy passed away at the age of 63. After years of heartbreak, she left this world without ever seeing the fair punishment she had hoped would be delivered to Justin Thurber. A peaceful morning in the countryside took a sudden turn when a farmer surveying his land stumbled upon something unusual. In a relatively remote area, overgrown with bushes and uneven terrain, his attention was drawn to suspicious shapes resembling a human skeleton. Police quickly secured the area, ensuring no evidence was disturbed. Forensic specialists, well-versed in the painstaking process of exhumation, arrived to carefully examine the scene, knowing that even the smallest detail could be the key to solving the mystery. When the official announcement confirmed that the remains belonged to Kelly Dwyer, the weight of the revelation hit the local community hard. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. This real documentary will be about Kelly Dwyer was born in 1986 and grew up in a smaller community outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin. From an early age, she showed a friendly, outgoing personality and a genuine curiosity about the world. Her family and close friends recall her as someone who could light up a room with her warm smile and easy laughter. After high school, she briefly considered moving out of state for college, but ultimately decided to stay closer to home, hoping to balance her studies with work. As she entered her 20s, Kelly's natural sociability led her to discover a love of customer-focused jobs, including roles in retail and service industries. She had an eye for style and enjoyed helping people feel confident in their appearance. Her friends often described her as the person who could chat with anyone and make them feel at ease. By the time she turned 27, Kelly had settled into a modest apartment in Milwaukee. Although she continued to hold retail positions, most recently at a boutique that sold contemporary clothing, she still harbored dreams of furthering her education or possibly starting a small business of her own one day. Her co-workers and managers appreciated her reliability and her warm demeanor with customers. In mid-2013, Kelly began dating Chris Zacco, a man who lived in a more upscale section of downtown Milwaukee. While little is known publicly about the early stage of their relationship, those who saw them together recall that Kelly seemed happy, enjoying the excitement of dating someone whose lifestyle was a bit faster paced than her own. On October 5, 2013, Kelly finished her shift at the boutique. That Friday night, she clocked out shortly after 8, gave a quick wave to the coworker who was locking up behind her, and stepped into the cool autumn air with an offhand text to a friend mentioning she would be spending the evening at her boyfriend's place. There was no sign of any apprehension in her last messages. Over the next few days, though, Kelly's normally responsive phone went silent, and that in itself sparked the first stirrings of concern among her friends. Initially, they tried to quell their worries by reminding each other how spontaneous Kelly could be. She had, after all, driven off on short hiking trips before with minimal notice. Yet as one day of silence stretched into 2, and she missed a scheduled weekend shift that she was never known to skip, alarm bells started ringing. Her mother, who lived in another part of Wisconsin, felt an indescribable maternal dread when repeated calls and texts to Kelly's phone went unanswered. By Monday, Kelly's manager at the boutique pointed out that she had failed to appear at work for 2 consecutive days, utterly unlike the usually punctual and committed employee. With growing urgency, Kelly's mother and a close friend arrived at the local police station to file a missing person report. The officers took their information, but with the typical cautious protocol surrounding adults who vanish, they reminded everyone that Kelly might have left voluntarily, urging a bit more time. Despite that standard approach, those who knew Kelly best were adamant that something was off. She was socially active, yes, and open to adventure, but she was also devoted to her friends and job. Within days, the conversation around Kelly's disappearance had expanded beyond her immediate circle to coworkers, casual acquaintances, and even local businesses. The boutique where she worked helped print missing person flyers featuring a clear headshot of her, beaming in a floral sundress. Soon, these posters were taped to telephone poles, pinned on community boards at coffee shops, and affixed to the windows of local diners, each urging anyone with information to come forward. People scanning the flyer learned that Kelly had last been seen in the early hours of October 5th, entering a downtown apartment building via its lobby door, captured by a security camera that never recorded her leaving. That fact alone, the absence of any footage documenting her departure, stoked immediate speculation. Did she slip out another exit, or did something sinister happen behind those closed doors? Meanwhile, local news stations began covering the story more prominently, sending reporters to stand outside the apartment building with a microphone in hand, delivering somber updates on the evening news. They played grainy clips from the security footage that showed Kelly stepping inside, wearing jeans, a light jacket, and carrying a small purse, looking entirely normal for a Friday night. The question no one could answer was what became of her once she crossed that threshold. Days turned into weeks, and the tension ratcheted higher with every fruitless lead. Kelly's friends formed small search parties, canvassing local bars, parks, and overlooked corners of Milwaukee in hopes of spotting anything that could hint at her whereabouts. The police, by that point, had stepped up their efforts as well. They began interviewing her boyfriend Chris Zacco more thoroughly, noting that he was the last known person to see Kelly alive. His story, repeated to friends and investigators, was that she left his apartment at some point early that morning and that he had no idea where she went afterward. But without camera footage of her departure or a clear timeline of text messages from her phone, it was difficult to confirm or deny his account. Investigators also pulled phone records, bank statements, and social media activity, scouring for any sign of digital footprints. Yet none of it offered a conclusive clue. Kelly's accounts showed no suspicious transactions, and her phone pinged its last known location near that downtown area, a detail that fit with what little they already knew. Unfortunately, the passing hours only compounded the sense of dread that hung over her family. As the second week ended, local newspapers began featuring the story on their front pages, some giving it a headline that read, "Missing in Milwaukee, where is Kelly Dwyer?" As the search continued, unverified rumors multiplied. Someone claimed to have seen Kelly at a gas station late one night 2 counties away. Another insisted she had traveled out of state with an unknown companion. But each new lead failed to produce results. The police publicly stressed that their investigation remained active, urging anyone who might have been in the downtown neighborhood near the time of her disappearance to come forward if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. Despite the heightened attention, the case seemed stuck in place, generating almost as many questions as it did fear. Nonetheless, the neighborhood where Kelly's boyfriend lived remained a focal point of speculation. The building's management cooperated with the police, turning over whatever footage they had, but it offered no clear answers. Meanwhile, the city braced itself for a harsh winter, the temperature dropping as if mirroring the sense of despair. The unanswered question remained stark. How could a vibrant young woman known by so many just vanish without a trace in a place lined with surveillance cameras? The first task enforcement was to confirm that Kelly's vanishing was indeed out of character. However, this lack of clarity only made investigators more determined to probe deeper, convinced that the last person to see Kelly, and the site where she was last known to be, held vital answers. In the early stages of the investigation, officers interviewed Chris multiple times, making careful note of any inconsistencies or gaps in his story. He described a routine evening. Kelly arrived, they chatted. They might have ordered takeout. He couldn't recall exactly. And they watched some television before going to bed. According to Chris, nothing about Kelly's behavior raised alarm. She neither argued nor showed signs of distress. He claimed that after sleeping for a few hours, she indicated she was heading home, and that was the last time he saw her. The detectives took down his version of events, but simultaneously requested a warrant to search his apartment for any physical evidence that could indicate whether Kelly had truly left on her own. At first, the search uncovered no obvious signs of a struggle, no bloodstains, no obvious disarray that might suggest violence. Yet the police removed certain items for further testing, including bedding and electronics, hoping that forensic analysis would turn up a trace of Kelly, or at least confirm or contradict Chris's timeline. While these steps were routine for a missing person case involving potential foul play, the sense of uncertainty in Kelly's circle of loved ones blossomed into an acute dread. Each day she remained missing amplified the likelihood that she had met with harm. A few neighbors recalled hearing muffled voices or a door slamming late that night, but no one could definitively tie such noise to Kelly, and certainly no one had seen her leaving. The case grew more perplexing when it was revealed that the building had multiple cameras but still failed to document Kelly's exit. Investigators asked themselves if there might be a blind spot, a service entrance, or some mishap in the timestamps that caused them to miss footage. Despite combing through hours of recordings, they found no conclusive evidence that Kelly ever stepped beyond that lobby again. The tension grew sharper when, during a subsequent search of Chris's apartment triggered by what investigators coyly referred to as additional probable cause, police discovered something that took the investigation in a disturbing new direction. Evidence of the presence of intimate videos on several electronic devices. Word of the discovery leaked before official charges were filed, stoking the public's fears that Chris might be capable of far darker acts than anyone had initially suspected. Once these allegations reached the media, Chris's name became inextricably tied to two horrifying ideas: a missing girlfriend and the possession of illegal sexual content. The city's conversation about Kelly's disappearance began to mix with revulsion at the possibility that Chris's private life concealed something far more twisted than a typical relationship gone wrong. Detectives had to balance these new revelations with the original goal of finding Kelly, or at least understanding what had happened to her. Although the pornography charges were separate, the very fact that Chris had concealed such material raised red flags about his credibility and moral compass. Investigators pored over his emails, browser history, and messaging apps, searching for mention of Kelly, potential communications with third parties that might reveal her whereabouts, or contradictory statements that could be used if the case ever went to trial. With law enforcement calling in acquaintances, co-workers, or anyone who had socialized with the couple, aiming to determine whether there had been any telling shift in Chris's behavior, was he known to be controlling, prone to jealousy, or involved in risk-taking activities that could spiral into a more dangerous scenario? Some acquaintances mentioned that Chris had bragged about access to prohibited substances, which, though not uncommon in certain circles, offered a fresh angle. Suspicions intensified when, during yet another round of searches and interviews, the police confirmed Chris also faced potential drug charges, having discovered paraphernalia and quantities of illegal substances in his possession. Nevertheless, the prohibited substances charges were enough to keep him entangled in the legal system, and he soon found himself in custody, facing bail hearings that the prosecution argued should be stringent, given the severity of the offenses. The police quietly ramped up their more direct investigative work surrounding Kelly's last known hours. They scrutinized phone logs and location data to confirm whether Chris's device traveled anywhere unusual that night or in the days following. They sent out specialized teams to comb through areas he might have frequented, from remote fields and wooded patches outside the city to industrial areas closer to downtown, hoping to uncover any trace that might link him to her disappearance. Local news bulletins were flooded with calls from citizens who claimed to have leads, but most were dead ends. A person who thought they saw Kelly at a highway rest stop, or someone who believed they recognized her from a blurred photograph on social media. The police dutifully followed each tip, only to return to the same unnerving silence. No confirmed sightings, no new evidence, and a tight-lipped suspect who blamed everything on either coincidence or an unfortunate series of misunderstandings. By the turn of the year, the district attorney's office had already filed multiple counts against Chris for the prohibited substances offenses. Behind the scenes, prosecutors conferred with detectives about the possibility of employing these charges as leverage, hoping to pressure Chris into revealing what he knew about Kelly's fate. However, any hopes that he might crack under legal pressure were dashed when he steadfastly maintained that he had zero involvement in her disappearance. His lawyers, likely realizing the significance of any statement regarding Kelly, advised him to remain silent on that subject. While Chris's court dates for the prohibited substances charges were scheduled, the Milwaukee Police Department pressed on, seeking to fill every hole in the timeline, recanvassing neighbors, rechecking parking garage footage, and making repeated appeals for fresh leads. In late spring of 2015, roughly a year and a half after Kelly Dwyer's disappearance, the Milwaukee community was jolted from a tense, sorrowful waiting game into a new wave of shock when word broke those human remains had been discovered in a rural stretch of Jefferson County, about an hour's drive from the city, and that investigators were converging on the site in hopes of answering the grim question that had haunted everyone for so long. The details initially trickling out were guarded and incomplete. A property owner in a relatively remote expanse of farmland had stumbled upon what seemed to be skeletal remains, partially obscured by brush and uneven terrain. The land, dotted with patches of tall grass and scattered stands of trees, was not the sort of place one might casually pass through on a daily basis, so it felt heartbreaking to imagine how long those remains might have been there, lying undiscovered while Kelly's family and friends clung to a fading hope that she might somehow reappear alive. Law enforcement acted swiftly, cordoning off the area and dispatching forensic specialists who were well-versed in the painstaking process of exhuming evidence from the outdoors, aware that any minor detail, a stray fiber, a particular brand of duct tape, or a personal item could illuminate the cause of death or at the very least, confirm the identity of the person who had been left there in such an unceremonious way. Though the authorities did not publicly confirm it right away, rumors spread almost instantly that this anonymous figure was, in fact, Kelly. For many who had followed her case since October 2013, there was an almost fatalistic sense that the timing, the location, and the condition of the remains made it unlikely to be anyone else. Nevertheless, the official identification required methodical comparison of dental records and, potentially, DNA samples. A process that demanded not only scientific precision, but also patience from a family desperate for answers. News crews descended on the scene, filming clusters of uniformed officers moving slowly across the property with handheld search equipment, expressionless and grim in the face of what they might find. When the final word came that the remains did indeed belong to Kelly Dwyer, it landed like a sledgehammer on a community that had, in many ways, grown emotionally invested in her plight. On the one hand, the discovery brought a sliver of relief to those who had feared she would remain missing forever. Her loved ones deprived of the closure that can come only when a body is found and laid to rest. On the other hand, this moment carried the crushing heartbreak of confirmation. There would be no miraculous reappearance, no joyous reunion, just the stark truth that Kelly had died violently or unexpectedly, and that someone, presumably, had gone to great lengths to hide her body. Official statements from the Milwaukee Police Department were terse but resolute. They were treating the discovery as a crucial turning point, certain that forensic evidence would provide vital clues about the manner and time of Kelly's death. Almost immediately, attention swung back to the man who had long been the central figure of suspicion. Chris, her boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. Yet the question now became whether the physical evidence recovered in Jefferson County might finally tie him to her death beyond circumstantial inferences. Although the police remained tight-lipped about any specifics, local journalists reported that certain personal effects found near or with Kelly's remains had been bagged and sent off to the state crime lab for DNA testing, a step that investigators hoped could link Chris to the disposal site or, conversely, open up the possibility that someone else might have been involved. Complicating matters was the advanced state of decomposition. Kelly had been missing for over a year and a half, and the frigid Wisconsin winters and humid summers could wreak havoc on forensic details. Identifying a cause of death, strangulation, blunt force trauma, or an overdose, would be far trickier now than it might have been had her remains been discovered earlier. Nevertheless, the involvement of experienced forensic pathologists offered some optimism that certain critical markers might still exist, whether in the condition of her bones, residual tissue, or soil samples surrounding the site. With each passing day, more evidence trickled in, but official statements gave the public only vague updates. We continue to analyze new data, or we have reason to believe that additional parties may have information. People asked how someone might have transported her remains to such a secluded area, whether this suggested a level of premeditation or panic, and, inevitably, whether there was a chance that someone else had a hand in the tragedy. Against this backdrop, Kelly's mother chose to speak publicly, flanked by friends holding photographs of Kelly in happier times. She expressed both profound grief and a determination to see justice served, insisting that her daughter's life would not be remembered solely for its tragic ending, but also for the warmth and kindness Kelly had shown in her 27 years. Mourners, some of whom had never even met Kelly, attended vigils to light candles in her memory. Meanwhile, the discovery of Kelly's remains granted the Milwaukee Police Department the impetus to ramp up pressure on Chris. Their logic was straightforward. If they could tie even the smallest physical artifact from the crime scene, like a fiber, a tire track, or a hair sample, to him, they would be far closer to building a homicide case rather than simply suspecting it. Simultaneously, prosecutors from the district attorney's office viewed the discovery as a chance to reopen dialogues about plea deals. Perhaps, they theorized, if faced with the specter of a homicide charge, Chris might at last reveal critical information in exchange for some leniency on other charges. If, that is, the evidence genuinely implicated him. Rumors circulated that Chris's legal team might argue that Kelly died accidentally, due to drug use or some other misadventure, and that he panicked. Yet without forensic evidence pinpointing an overdose, or a note in which Kelly acknowledged a plan to take dangerous substances, such a defense was speculative at best, and the public skepticism ran high. Many believed that if Kelly's death had been purely accidental, there would have been no need to hide her body in a remote rural area and remain silent for over a year. Nevertheless, these swirling theories only underscored the complexity investigators faced. In high-profile cases, the line between fact-finding and rumor-chasing can blur, and the Milwaukee PD had learned the hard way that incomplete public statements can lead to wild conjectures that muddy the truth rather than clarify it. During this time, the discovery site itself was a hive of activity, with forensic anthropologists painstakingly sifting through dirt and debris, photographing every angle, collecting samples for advanced laboratory analysis. This painstaking process took days, and even after the remains were removed, further sweeps of the surrounding terrain continued. Officers wanted to ensure they didn't miss something as seemingly trivial as a scrap of clothing or a piece of jewelry that could hold enormous significance in a courtroom. Locals living near the property reported seeing police cars parked by the side of the road for weeks, and more than a few admitted that the entire ordeal had rattled them. The emotional toll of that decision was incalculable. For months, the family had walked a razor's edge between hope and despair, but the final confirmation of Kelly's identity from dental records forced an acceptance they had tried to stave off. Quietly, in the background, detectives kept pursuing every angle, aware that the window for new leads might be short. Though they withheld specifics, authorities hinted that they had gathered promising leads from the scene. Milwaukee braced for the next phase, a phase that would, everyone hoped, involve real accountability for the person or persons responsible for her death and disposal. After so many false starts, unconfirmed rumors, and heartbreaking dead ends, the city held its breath, knowing that the final resolution might be as brutal as everything that had come before, and yet still necessary if Kelly's family and friends were to find any sense of peace in the midst of an unthinkable tragedy. In the months that followed, the prosecution's case centered on the idea that Chris had both motive and opportunity to harm Kelly. They asserted that she died in his downtown apartment after a night of prohibited substances use, a scenario that, according to their theory, turned deadly due to either an overdose he failed to report or an act of violence that Chris attempted to conceal. They further argued that even if she had died by accidental means, Chris's actions in hiding her body in a remote rural location demonstrated consciousness of guilt and a desperate need to evade the consequences. Before formal charges could be filed, however, the district attorney's office demanded rigorous review of every piece of evidence that might stand up in court. Phone records plotting Chris's location at suspicious hours, his own inconsistent statements about the time Kelly supposedly left his apartment, and any forensic links, such as fibers from her clothing or traces of her DNA, that might have been transferred into his vehicle. Working alongside detectives, the DA scoured hours of police interviews for even the smallest contradiction in Chris's version of events, believing that a pattern of falsehoods could be as damning as any direct piece of physical evidence. The pretrial hearings provided a glimpse of the evidence prosecutors hoped would convince a jury that Chris was responsible for Kelly's death. Much of it hinged on the damning digital trail. Location data showed Chris's phone leaving the city in the hours after Kelly was last seen, traveling in a direction consistent with Jefferson County, albeit with some gaps that suggested his device might have been turned off or otherwise out of service range. Zacco claimed he drove 160 miles round trip to buy a half-pound block of cheese for his girlfriend's parents. But investigators say he did it so he could finally dispose of Kelly's body somewhere in rural Wisconsin. Prosecutors also hinted at communications, text messages or internet searches, that they claimed betrayed a man either planning or covering up a fatal incident. The court's initial proceedings saw Chris's defense attorney objecting to the admission of certain materials, branding them as speculative or obtained without proper warrants. The defense posture was clear from the outset. They would accept no blame for Kelly's death unless the prosecution could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Chris himself had caused her harm. They contended that her prohibited substances use was more extensive than her friends believed. implying that she could have overdosed at his apartment and that he panicked, hiding her body rather than calling for help. A callous act, they admitted, but not necessarily first-degree reckless homicide. This line of argument forced the prosecution to walk a narrow path. On one side, they could not dismiss the possibility of an overdose outright, since forensic experts, owing to the decomposition of Kelly's remains, could not categorically identify the exact cause of death as strangulation, blunt force trauma, or anything else specific. On the other side, the behavior Chris exhibited afterward, allegedly transporting Kelly's body, discarding personal items, and lying to police, constituted, in their view, a strong sign of guilt. Observers of the court proceedings noted that Chris often appeared subdued, occasionally glancing at Kelly's mother but otherwise showing little emotion. The courtroom opening statements revealed the prosecution's central narrative. Chris and Kelly had been using prohibited substances, an activity he commonly engaged in and sometimes pressured her to join, and that under the influence of these substances, she lost consciousness. Rather than seek medical help, Chris allegedly delayed any response, either because he feared police involvement in his prohibited substances dealings or because there was a violent confrontation between them. Prosecutors argued that by neglecting to call for assistance and then deliberately hiding Kelly's body, Chris demonstrated that he knew he had caused or contributed to her death in some reckless capacity. They also alluded to phone logs that placed him in the Jefferson County vicinity around the time Kelly's phone ceased transmissions entirely. Woven into this framework was the testimony of forensic pathologists who admitted that, while they could not pinpoint a single lethal injury, the condition of Kelly's remains was suggestive of a hasty, clandestine burial that no innocent bystander would orchestrate. Chris's defense, for its part, stuck firmly to the overdose scenario. They leaned on the uncertainty in the autopsy findings, arguing that not being able to prove cause of death equated to not being able to prove homicide. They depicted Chris as someone overwhelmed by panic and, yes, moral cowardice, but not a cold-blooded killer. In cross-examinations, they pressed forensic experts to acknowledge the limitations of their findings, pointing out that without definitive signs of strangulation or physical assault, the claim that Chris had intentionally harmed Kelly was purely speculative. Their cross-examinations of police investigators were likewise pointed, zeroing in on the possibility that the department had made up its mind early in the missing person investigation and pursued Chris to the exclusion of other leads. They asked, for instance, whether authorities had fully examined the possibility that Kelly left the apartment on her own and came to harm later, or that someone else entirely might have discovered her in a vulnerable state. These arguments often felt stretched to outside observers, but in a criminal trial where the state must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, even thin narratives can sow uncertainty in jurors' minds. Yet as the trial progressed, the prosecution rolled out what they considered their crown jewel of evidence, a series of text messages, partially recovered by digital forensic specialists, in which Chris hinted at frustrations with Kelly, referencing her alleged reluctance to keep pace with his lifestyle and prohibited substances use. One ominous text was read aloud, in which Chris told a friend that Kelly can't handle what I do, and I'll have to deal with that later, though the defense argued that the statement merely referred to typical relationship bickering. More potentially incriminating were the location pings gleaned from Chris's cell phone, showing his device traveling an unusual route that prosecutors mapped in detail, itemizing approximate times that aligned with the hours after Kelly was last seen alive. They insisted that even if the exact manner of death remained uncertain, Chris's subsequent actions, carefully disposing of her body, offering shifting explanations to friends and investigators, and continuing his life without alerting anyone, constituted the essence of reckless homicide. The defense retorted that moral repugnance did not necessarily equate to legal guilt of homicide. If Kelly overdosed, disposing of her body was indeed an abhorrent act, but not synonymous with murder. Each side pleaded with the jury to see through the other's alleged misdirections, culminating in a tense wait for the final verdict. When the jury returned, the room was charged with an almost tangible gravity. News cameras lingered outside the courthouse, capturing every shift in expression on the faces of spectators. Ultimately, the jury found Chris guilty of first-degree manslaughter and concealing a corpse. a verdict that sent a wave of emotion, both relief and sadness, through the assembled spectators. Kelly's mother openly wept, clutching a small pendant containing her daughter's photograph. The defense team, by contrast, quietly announced their intention to appeal on the grounds that the forensic evidence was inconclusive and that prejudicial references to Chris's other charges tainted the jury's perception. Nonetheless, the immediate reality stood. Chris faced a substantial prison term. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors painted a picture of a manipulative individual who not only caused or allowed Kelly's death, but also attempted to erase any record of her existence afterward. Chris's attorneys sought leniency, arguing that while his decisions had been wrong-headed, they were the byproduct of addiction and panic rather than a deliberate intent to kill. The presiding judge, however, made it clear that dumping someone's body in a remote field without alerting authorities, especially someone with whom one was ostensibly in a caring relationship, required a measure of accountability commensurate with the gravity of the loss. In the end, in December 2018, Chris Zacco was sentenced to 31 years in prison for the murder of Kelly Dwyer. Night, when Raven returned home, he had no idea that he was about to stumble upon a scene so gruesome and shocking that it would change the course of his life forever. The moment he stepped through the door, the familiar comfort of his home vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. On the cold floor lay Janet's lifeless body. At first, Raven's mind struggled to make sense of it. His first thought was that she had been shot, perhaps a break-in gone terribly wrong. But as paramedics arrived, the grim truth became clear. This was no random act of violence. It was something far more sinister, calculated, and deeply disturbing. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. This documentary will focus on Janet Abaroa, was born on June 19, 1979, in a quiet and picturesque small town in Virginia. She was the seventh of 10 children in a large and close-knit family that placed deep importance on faith, values, and togetherness. From childhood, Janet had an innate love for children, often taking on the role of caretaker for her younger siblings. She harbored dreams of one day having a big family of her own, where she could provide the same warmth and love that she had experienced in her upbringing. Alongside her nurturing nature, Janet was also highly disciplined and excelled academically. Schoolwork came easily to her, and she managed to balance her studies with an active participation in sports. As she progressed to high school and later to college, she continued to pursue her passion for sports, playing for local teams and eventually joining the women's soccer team at the University of Southern Virginia. It was during one of her college matches in 1998 that Janet met Raven Abaroa, a talented soccer player who played for the Southern Virginia University men's soccer team. The two were immediately drawn to each other, and what started as a casual friendship soon blossomed into a deep and passionate romance. Their relationship flourished for 2 years, and in that time, they grew inseparable. Finally, Raven, despite being a year younger than Janet, proposed to her, declaring his unwavering love and commitment. She happily accepted, and in August 2000, they were married in the Sacred Mormon Temple in Washington, D.C. A significant and deeply meaningful event for both of them and their families. Following their wedding, the couple eagerly embarked on their new journey together, setting their sights on building a stable and happy life. The first major step they took was seeking employment to ensure financial independence. They secured jobs as salespeople at a sporting goods store, which required them to relocate to Durham, North Carolina. Upon arrival, they rented a modest house in the suburbs, hoping to establish a solid foundation for their future. To the outside world, Janet and Raven appeared to be the picture-perfect couple. Young, ambitious, and deeply in love. Friends, neighbors, and even colleagues admired their relationship and often spoke of how they complemented each other. However, beneath the surface, cracks began to form in their seemingly ideal marriage. Not long after settling into their new life, Janet confided in close family members and friends that Raven was not the devoted husband he appeared to be. She discovered that he was unfaithful, engaging in extramarital affairs with multiple women. The betrayals were painful and humiliating, shattering her trust in him. On one occasion, he even left home for several days without any explanation, only to return as if nothing had happened. Amidst this turmoil, Janet discovered she was pregnant, a revelation that brought both joy and anxiety. While she had always dreamed of becoming a mother, the circumstances surrounding her marriage left her feeling conflicted and uncertain about the future. She feared raising a child alone, but was equally troubled by the prospect of staying with a man who continually betrayed her trust. During this challenging time, Janet found solace in the friendships she built within her neighborhood. She grew close to several women who became a support system for her, offering advice, encouragement, and companionship. These friends even confronted Raven, urging him to change his ways and remain faithful to his pregnant wife. Whether out of guilt or genuine intention, Raven promised to mend his ways and become a devoted husband and father. Janet, hoping for the best, allowed herself to believe that things would improve, especially with the impending arrival of their baby. On October 17th, 2004, Janet gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, whom they named Caden. The moment she held her son in her arms, everything else faded into the background. Her primary focus became providing him with the best life possible. She devoted herself entirely to motherhood, showering Caden with love and care, determined to give him a stable upbringing. However, the joy of motherhood was overshadowed by the financial struggles the family faced. With Janet no longer working, their household depended solely on Raven's income from his job as a salesman, which was barely enough to cover their expenses. They quickly fell behind on rent, prompting their landlord to offer them a 3-month grace period out of sympathy for their situation. Despite this temporary relief, their financial troubles only worsened. In December 2004, just 2 months after Caden's birth, the situation took a drastic turn. During this period, their son Caden was merely 2 months old when tragedy struck once more. The child's father, Raven Abaroa, found himself in serious legal trouble. He was arrested for theft after being caught stealing merchandise from the very sporting goods store where he and his wife had been employed. Investigators discovered that he had stolen several high-end tracksuits and resold them online for quick cash. The total amount of damages resulting from his actions exceeded $10,000, leading to swift legal consequences. Unsurprisingly, he was immediately terminated from his position, and in the wake of this disgraceful scandal, Janet, unable to withstand the shame and humiliation of her husband's actions, also resigned from her job. Though the charges against him could have resulted in jail time, Raven managed to evade incarceration. Instead, he was sentenced to 2 years of probation and ordered to pay $15,000 in restitution to the sporting goods store. This left both parents unemployed, financially destitute, and struggling to provide for their newborn child. With a criminal record now attached to his name, Raven found it nearly impossible to secure stable employment. To make ends meet, the couple resorted to part-time jobs and relied heavily on the support of family and friends who offered financial and emotional assistance. Despite the mounting stress and hardship, the young family fought to stay afloat. But their struggles would soon take a much darker and more sinister turn. On the evening of April 26, 2005, Janet picked up Caden from daycare as she did every day. She and her infant son returned home, where she began preparing dinner, settling into the routine of motherhood. Later that evening, Raven arrived home, sat down for dinner with his wife, and, after spending time with his family, announced that he was heading to Morrisville to participate in an indoor soccer game. At the time, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. However, upon returning home that night, Raven stumbled upon a gruesome and shocking scene that would alter the course of his life forever. The home, once a sanctuary, had become a nightmarish crime scene. Blood splattered the walls and floor, creating a horrifying tableau of violence. Janet's lifeless body lay sprawled in an unnatural position on the floor, a dark pool of blood surrounding her. Their infant son, Caden, lay unharmed in his crib, wailing helplessly in distress. Overcome with shock and horror, Raven frantically dialed 911. His voice panicked as he reported his wife's murder. He told the emergency operator that he had just returned home to find Janet covered in blood, seemingly attacked by an unknown assailant.
911, where is your emergency? I'm dead! She's shot in the shot.
Initially, he speculated that she had been shot, but when paramedics arrived, it became evident that she had been stabbed multiple times. The crime was brutal, precise, and deeply disturbing. Janet, a young mother with her whole life ahead of her, had died instantly from the fatal wounds inflicted upon her. Law enforcement officers were shaken by the sheer savagery of the crime. The immediate question that loomed over the investigation was, who could commit such a heinous act against a woman who had devoted her life to her family? Forensic experts meticulously combed through the crime scene, collecting critical evidence that might lead to the perpetrator. The victim's body was transported to the medical examiner's office, where an autopsy was performed to determine the exact cause of death. The autopsy report revealed that Janet had sustained 3 deep stab wounds. One was found on her left arm, which forensic experts identified as a defensive wound, indicating that she had fought back against her attacker. The second wound was located in her chest, a lethal strike that contributed to her rapid demise. However, it was the third wound that sealed her fate. A deep stab wound to the neck severed a major artery, causing Janet to lose blood at an alarming rate. Within seconds, she had likely fallen unconscious, and within minutes, her life had ended. Adding to the tragedy, an autopsy confirmed that Janet was pregnant at the time of the murder. The loss of both mother and unborn child sent shockwaves through the community, amplifying the urgency of the investigation. Despite the calculated precision of the attack, forensic experts struggled to determine the exact sequence of the fatal blows. The body exhibited early signs of decomposition, but the low temperature inside the home had likely slowed the process, making it difficult to pinpoint the precise time of death. While forensic specialists worked to piece together the puzzle through physical evidence, detectives turned their attention to potential witnesses who might have seen or heard anything unusual that evening. Almost immediately, their focus shifted to the person who would naturally be considered a suspect, the husband of the deceased, Raven Abaroa. Given the nature of the crime and the history of turmoil in their marriage, he became a person of significant interest in the case. Raven was called in for questioning multiple times, and based on his statements, investigators attempted to reconstruct the timeline of events leading up to Janet's tragic death. According to his account, he had returned home around 8 p.m. that evening before leaving shortly after to attend his soccer game in Morrisville. He claimed that he did not return home until approximately 10:40 p.m. Upon entering the house, he allegedly called out to his wife, but when she did not respond, he proceeded upstairs. It was there, he insisted, that he discovered her lifeless body. Raven told detectives that Janet sometimes knelt in an unusual posture to relieve leg cramps. Janet was found kneeling with her head pressed against the floor, motionless and unresponsive. At first, Raven was unsure of what he was witnessing, but when he turned on the lights, he was confronted with a horrifying scene. In a state of panic, he quickly turned his wife onto her side and realized with a sinking feeling that she was already dead. Forensic experts later explained that the positioning of her body could have allowed blood to flow steadily from the deep stab wounds, particularly the severed artery, until the thickening process naturally slowed the bleeding. This could have continued for several hours, suggesting that Janet had been deceased for some time before Raven's arrival. However, given the catastrophic nature of her injuries, forensic specialists could not rule out the possibility that she had been killed just moments before he entered the home. The uncertainty surrounding the exact time of death only added to the growing list of questions detectives needed to answer. When questioned about possible suspects who might have wanted to harm Janet, Raven provided an unexpected and perplexing theory. He suggested that the recent financial difficulties the couple had been facing had taken a severe emotional toll on his wife. In his opinion, Janet had succumbed to the overwhelming burden of their economic struggles and had taken her own life. According to him, she had been acting strangely in the days leading up to her death, often blaming herself for their predicament and expressing distress over their financial instability. However, this claim was immediately met with skepticism and outright rejection by Janet's family and close friends. They insisted that Raven's statements were entirely false, fabricated to mislead investigators. Those closest to Janet knew firsthand how she truly felt. She had confided in them regularly, sharing her frustrations and struggles, but never once had she voiced any inclination toward self-harm. Furthermore, forensic evidence made it abundantly clear that she could not have inflicted these wounds on herself. Compounding the suspicions, evidence at the crime scene suggested that someone else had been in the house at the time of the murder. A bloody shoe print was discovered near Janet's body, along with a fingerprint that did not immediately match hers or Raven's. Strangely, there were no signs of forced entry. The doors and windows were all intact, leading detectives to one unsettling conclusion. The victim either knew the perpetrator and willingly allowed them into the home, or the attacker already had access to the residence. Either way, this pointed to someone familiar with Janet, someone close enough to enter without resistance. Despite the brutal nature of the attack, there were very few signs of a struggle. The only indication of self-defense was a stab wound to Janet's arm, suggesting she had attempted to shield herself from the fatal blows. This supported the theory that the attack was swift and unexpected. Adding to the mystery, Raven claimed that his wife had already been asleep when he left for his soccer game. If true, this meant that the murderer had likely struck after she had gone to bed, making it even more likely that the killer was someone she trusted enough not to wake up for. Another strange detail stood out to investigators. The only missing items from the house were Raven's laptop and 2 kitchen knives. One of these knives was almost certainly the murder weapon, but the absence of the laptop suggested the possibility that someone wanted to destroy evidence rather than steal valuables. Intriguingly, the perpetrator had ignored other valuable items in the home, including Janet's wedding rings and other jewelry, indicating that robbery was not the motive. At that stage, detectives lacked concrete evidence to arrest anyone, including Raven, so he was temporarily released. However, law enforcement officials had already begun to suspect that he was not as innocent as he claimed. Investigators decided to monitor his actions closely, believing that he might eventually expose himself through his behavior. What followed only deepened their suspicions. Just one day after Janet's murder, Raven packed his belongings, took his infant son Caden, and abruptly left for Utah. On the surface, this move might have been seen as natural. After all, many widowers find it unbearable to remain in the home where their loved one was violently taken from them. Furthermore, given that Raven's family resided in Utah, it made sense that he would seek their support in such a difficult time. However, his behavior upon arriving in Utah raised red flags for both his own relatives and the friends of the deceased. Instead of displaying the grief and devastation one would expect from a man who had just lost his wife in such a horrific manner, Raven appeared indifferent and detached. Witnesses noted that he showed little concern for finding Janet's killer or seeking justice for her murder. Instead, he completely distanced himself from the case, as if he wanted to forget it had ever happened. He ignored calls from investigators and refused to cooperate with authorities. Investigators had stumbled upon a potential motive when they discovered that shortly before the murder, Raven had taken out a significant life insurance policy on Janet's life. The amount? A staggering $600,000. This revelation raised immediate red flags. Given the couple's well-documented financial struggles, it was deeply suspicious that Raven, who often complained about their lack of funds, had somehow managed to consistently pay the policy premiums. Even more alarming was the timeline. Evidence showed that Raven had filed a claim with the insurance company almost immediately after Janet's murder, before her body had even been laid to rest. This brazen move only deepened law enforcement's suspicions. The entire situation reeked of foul play, but it was not yet enough to prove his direct involvement in Janet's death. As detectives delved deeper into Raven's past, they unearthed a web of lies that had surrounded his relationship with Janet from the very beginning. He had presented himself to her as a devout Mormon, claiming to have embarked on a missionary trip to Peru. But it was all fabricated. The stories he had spun to create an illusion of virtue unraveled one by one. Though these deceptions did not directly tie him to the crime, they painted a picture of a man skilled in manipulation and deceit, someone who could craft a compelling narrative to serve his own interests. After Janet's death, Raven relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah, where he maintained a low profile. He quietly collected his insurance payout and focused on raising his son, all while seemingly moving forward with his life. But his fresh start did not mean he had abandoned his ways. It was here that he met a woman named Vanessa Pond, a kindergarten teacher who quickly became enamored with the charming single father. Their relationship progressed rapidly, facilitated by the fact that Raven had enrolled son in the school where Vanessa worked. Their frequent encounters turned into something deeper, and before long, they were inseparable. Like Janet before her, Vanessa was drawn to Raven's persistent, charismatic nature. She had spent years raising her child alone and had longed for a partner who would not only love her, but also provide a stable family unit. Raven fit the mold perfectly, at least on the surface. It wasn't long before he began weaving another intricate web of deception. When discussing his past, he told Vanessa that his late wife had tragically died in a car accident. Unbeknownst to Raven, Janet's family was still watching him closely. They had never stopped suspecting him and had made it their mission to track his movements. When they discovered his new relationship, they became even more determined to expose him. To their shock, they found that Raven was continuing his pattern of deception, lying to everyone around him about Janet's fate. He had constructed a false reality in which he was the grieving widower of a tragic accident, rather than the prime suspect in a vicious murder. For a while, Vanessa remained blissfully unaware of the truth. She trusted Raven completely and had no reason to question his version of events. But curiosity has a way of creeping in. Eventually, she began to dig into his past. It didn't take long for her to uncover the chilling truth. Janet had been the victim of a brutal stabbing, and her murder was still an open investigation. Shocked, she confronted Raven. His response was as manipulative as ever. He claimed that he had been unfairly targeted by the police and the public, who were obsessed with pinning the crime on him. He insisted that Janet had been killed during a robbery, and that he had been falsely accused simply because he was her husband. Amazingly, Vanessa believed him. He had an uncanny ability to distort reality, and once again, his lies worked. Despite the evidence staring her in the face, she accepted his explanation, convinced that he was being unfairly persecuted. But Janet's family was determined to intervene. They reached out to Vanessa, warning her that she could be in grave danger. They urged her to reconsider her involvement with Raven, emphasizing the unsettling parallels between her relationship with him and what Janet had endured. Yet Vanessa was too deeply entwined in Raven's web to see the truth. She dismissed the concerns, trusting the man who had charmed his way into her life. Her unwavering faith in him led to their marriage after 3 years of dating. To the outside world, it appeared that Raven had finally moved on and built a new life. But beneath the surface, history was repeating itself. The cracks in their relationship began to show almost immediately. What had once seemed like a fairy tale romance quickly unraveled into a nightmare. Vanessa soon witnessed the same troubling behavior that Janet had endured. Raven's unpredictable mood swings, his bursts of rage, and his controlling tendencies. He began losing control, becoming volatile and aggressive. As the marriage progressed, his behavior worsened. He raised his hand to her in anger, issuing threats that left her terrified for her safety. Fear took root in Vanessa's heart. She had believed she had found love, only to realize she had walked into a dangerous situation. The abuse escalated, and she knew she had to escape. Their marriage, which had once held so much promise, crumbled in just 4 months. She made the difficult decision to leave him, fearing that if she stayed, she might meet the same fate as Janet. Since the pressure from the detectives did not stop, Raven decided to talk to the press. The man publicly expressed hope that the police would eventually solve the case, identify the true perpetrator, and finally stop treating him as a suspect. As media coverage around Raven intensified and more details of Janet's murder emerged, she found herself tormented by an unbearable question. Could her ex-husband have actually murdered his first wife? Vanessa decided to come forward and speak with the media. She confirmed what many had already suspected. Raven Abaroa had always been unstable, manipulative, and prone to fits of aggression. The worst incident, according to Vanessa, occurred on Christmas Eve in 2008. During one of their frequent heated arguments, an argument that he had provoked, Raven suddenly locked her inside the bathroom. Through the locked door, he shouted threats at her, saying he wanted to hit her, that he despised her, and that he wouldn't care if she died. Vanessa's fear was justified. The new detectives working the case felt similarly. They enthusiastically resumed the investigation, determined to piece together the sequence of events that had led to Janet's tragic and brutal death. Everything they examined pointed to one conclusion: Raven was the killer. The primary challenge, however, remained his alibi. Investigators revisited the 911 call he had made upon discovering his wife's body, scrutinizing every word. A major red flag stood out. During the call, Raven claimed that Janet had been shot. This was a glaring mistake. The wounds on her body were clearly stab wounds, and even in a state of shock, it seemed improbable that he wouldn't be able to distinguish between the two. While this wasn't definitive proof of guilt, detectives believed it was an intentional attempt to mislead the investigation. Perhaps he thought that by falsely reporting gunshot wounds, he could create confusion and delay forensic analysis. The police weren't buying his story. They decided to pressure him further. They reached out, asking for a follow-up phone interview. During this call, Raven repeated the same version of events he had told before. However, just like in previous interrogations, he was oddly vague on key details. He struggled to recall significant moments from the night of the murder, an unusual lapse in memory for someone who had gone through such a traumatic event. At one point, he even mocked the police, asserting that they had failed to locate one of the missing knives from his home, which he had later found himself while moving. But the detectives weren't fooled. They knew that their forensic team had conducted an exhaustive examination of the crime scene. If they hadn't found a missing knife, it was because it simply wasn't there. Raven's story reeked of manipulation. Over the years, as the case continued to stall, the new team of investigators struggled to reconstruct the original crime scene and timeline with absolute certainty. As part of their renewed efforts, detectives began reaching out to Raven's past girlfriends, hoping to uncover more about his character. Their findings were both disturbing and eerily consistent. Every woman they spoke to painted a chillingly similar picture. Raven was controlling, volatile, and prone to violent outbursts. Many of them admitted that his aggressive tendencies had been the primary reason for the end of their relationships. These testimonies further strengthened the case against him. Another peculiar detail emerged, something seemingly small but potentially significant. Before leaving for his soccer game on the night of the murder, Raven had locked his dog inside the garage. This was highly unusual. He had never done this before. When asked about it, he provided no logical explanation. However, detectives suspected they knew the real reason. A dog is naturally protective of its home and owner. If an intruder had attacked Janet, the dog would have likely reacted, barking loudly and possibly even attacking the perpetrator. Investigators also uncovered a suspicious action taken by the suspect the day before the crime. Raven had transferred data from his laptop onto another storage device. This raised serious red flags. It seemed more like an act of deliberate preparation rather than a coincidence, particularly since the laptop was reported stolen soon after. This discovery added to the mounting pile of circumstantial evidence. Based on these developments, on February 1, 2010, Raven Abaroa was officially arrested on suspicion of first-degree murder. He was extradited to North Carolina to face trial, but despite the growing suspicion against him, the case remained largely circumstantial. Investigators knew they needed more concrete evidence to secure a conviction, so they meticulously continued combing through crime scene photos and forensic reports. During this renewed scrutiny, a detective made an important observation. In one of the crime scene photographs, an empty contact lens case was visible on the bedside table. This seemingly insignificant detail took on great importance when Janet's parents insisted that their daughter never slept with her lenses in. She always removed them before going to bed. However, Raven had repeatedly told investigators that when he left for his soccer game that night, Janet was already in bed, asleep with their baby. This discrepancy raised a crucial question. Could Janet have been murdered before ever going to bed, contradicting Raven's timeline entirely? Unfortunately, during the initial autopsy, the medical examiner had not checked whether Janet had been wearing her contact lenses at the time of her death. Determined to find the truth, Janet's grieving family supported an exhumation of her body to confirm this theory. In July 2010, forensic experts exhumed Janet's remains. Despite decomposition, they found what appeared to be the remnants of contact lenses on her eyes. Though the material had dried out and deformed over time, advanced forensic techniques allowed them to confirm that the lenses had indeed been in place when she died. To ensure that this discovery would hold weight in court, experts conducted a large-scale experiment that took nearly a year. Using pig's eyes, similar in structure to human eyes, scientists inserted contact lenses and subjected them to an embalming process identical to what human bodies go through before burial. The results were conclusive. Contact lenses remained intact and detectable even after extended decomposition. This experiment definitively proved that Janet had been murdered while still wearing her lenses, reinforcing the theory that she was attacked before bedtime. Raven's claim that she had been asleep when he left was now irrefutably proven false, further implicating him in the crime. By the time the trial began in 2013, the case had garnered widespread public attention. The prosecution laid out a compelling case against Raven, making it clear that they firmly believed he was guilty of murdering his wife. However, the biggest challenge for the prosecution remained the lack of direct evidence. Everything pointed to Raven, but there was no smoking gun. The defense capitalized on this fact, arguing that all the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no definitive proof linking Raven to the murder. During the investigation, yet another damning piece of evidence emerged, one that further exposed Raven's deception. Throughout the police interrogations, he had repeatedly claimed that he found his wife already dead upon his arrival home. But investigators learned that he had made a shocking confession during a conversation at a local church. In that confession, Raven admitted that Janet had still been alive when he found her. He claimed that she had even attempted to speak before collapsing and dying in front of him. As the case unfolded, detectives explored another potential motive. Was Janet planning to leave her husband? Investigators discovered that in the weeks leading up to her death, Janet had been in contact with an old boyfriend, a man named Scott. Some speculated that she might have been rekindling a romantic relationship, but upon examining their exchanges, detectives found no clear evidence of an affair. Instead, their messages suggested that she had only just begun reaching out, possibly seeking emotional support rather than intimacy. Another crucial argument presented by the prosecution was centered around a possible motive for the crime: Janet's unplanned pregnancy. According to investigators, Janet had only shared this news with a select few, including several of her sisters. Those close to her confirmed that she was elated at the thought of becoming a mother again, but at the same time, she harbored doubts about Raven's ability to be a responsible father. Given their already dire financial situation, prosecutors suggested that the pregnancy might have been the breaking point for Raven. The possibility of another child could have exacerbated their economic struggles, fueling tensions within the marriage. This, the prosecution argued, might have pushed Raven to commit the ultimate crime, eliminating Janet rather than facing the challenges of another child. As new revelations continued to surface, the defense filed a motion to have the trial delayed, arguing that the character portrayals of both the victim and the defendant had not been fully explored. The court granted the motion, rescheduling the next phase of the trial for March 2014. By this time, however, a dramatic turn of events had occurred. Raven Abaroa, likely realizing that the mounting evidence against him was too substantial to fight, agreed to a plea deal with the prosecution. Under the terms of the deal, Raven was sentenced to 10 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after serving 8 years.